Thanks, y'all. I'm going to try to move this down there. Thank you. Well, thank y'all very much. So I'm going to get going, if you don't mind. So, why in the world would you put a space center in Houston? Why in heaven's name would you put a space center in Texas at all? This had to be going through the minds of millions of Americans on September 19th, 1961, the day the U.S. government announced that the new space center, the gateway to the final frontier and the harbinger of the space age, would be placed in Houston, Texas. But why Texas? Wasn't Texas populated by rubes and provincials, hicks even? The New York novelist Edna Ferber certainly seemed to think so, as she populated the state with such backwards characters in her novel Giant. Many Americans assumed that Texans still had gunfights outside of their saloons. At best, Texas was home to rich and boorish oilmen, donning 10-gallon hats. Rich, not because they deserved it or earned it, like back east fortunes, but rich because they were lucky. There was oil underneath their pastures, and drilling rigs where the hen houses used to be. They were new money, and worse than that, they were undeserving money. Texans had ignorant country accents. They had horse-riding ranchers. They looked backwards to the Alamo, to cowboys and Indians, not forward to Mercury and Saturn rockets and Gemini and Apollo capsules. No, Texas was not the worthy vessel for carrying our nation into a new age. Texas was definitely not supposed to be the home of the single greatest scientific achievement humanity had ever seen. Yet it was. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to reach space. This wasn't just huge, it was colossal. But what did it mean? It meant, quite emphatically, that the United States was losing the freshly brewed Cold War. Not only could the Soviets harness nuclear warheads to those rockets, but they had such deft engineering touch that they could send a man to the harsh environment of space and bring him back unscathed. What would President Kennedy do? On May 25th, 1961, he delivered an answer. In a speech before a joint session of Congress, Kennedy acknowledged the Soviet success, stating, "Recognizing the head start obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, we are required to make new efforts of our own. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project of this period will be more important to mankind or more impressive in the long-range exploration of space." The United States didn't just want to put a man into orbit. No, that'd be too easy. They were going to put a man on the moon. To do so, they needed a facility, a place where they could make groundbreaking discoveries and manage highly technical projects, the likes of which humanity had never before seen, a place that would change the world. Where on earth could our nation meet this challenge? The great state of Texas. On July 21st, 1961, Congress appropriated $1.8 billion to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, with $60 million of that budget earmarked for a manned spaceflight laboratory. James Webb, the second director of NASA, asked John F. Parsons, the associate director of the Ames Research Center, to head a site selection team. The winning site, according to requirements made available by Congress, required access to water transportation by large barges, a moderate climate, availability of an all-weather commercial jet service system, a well-established industrial complex with supporting technical facilities and labor, close proximity to a culturally attractive community within the vicinity of an institution of higher education, a strong electric utility and water supply, at least 1,000 acres of land, and other specified cost parameters. The hunt was on. Between August 21st and September 7th, 1961, the team visited 23 sites across the country, beginning in Jacksonville, Florida, and ending in Palo Alto, California. During this time, they were under immense political pressure, specifically from governors and senators from Massachusetts, Virginia, and California, who were all hell-bent on the Space Center being in their respective states. California was perfect, beautiful weather and sunsets on the beach. Virginia was historic. The president was from Massachusetts, and it would have made an excellent accomplishment to bring the lab to his home state. When it came time to make the selection, the team had narrowed it down to its top 3 choices: MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, mainly because the Air Force planned to shut down their strategic air commands at the base, meaning the infrastructure would already be in place; Houston, Texas, and San Francisco, California. But at the last second, the Air Force decided not to close their base at MacDill, effectively removing Tampa from consideration. Thus, to the dismay of many states who made their plea, on September 14, 1961, Webb informed Kennedy that a site offered by Rice University in Houston, Texas, had been chosen. Shocked? So were many Americans. Those ignorant Texans had stumbled into the greatest science project of the 20th century. Certainly some backroom deal had been struck because they weren't the first choice and definitely not the most ideal. But they were handed the baton, and in true Texas fashion, they ran with it. The announcement was made public on September 19, 1961. Evidently, the city of Houston had much more to offer than many had originally thought. It had the right weather, kinda, William P. Hobby Airport, and 1,000 acres of land made available to the government by Rice. As an aside, that 1,000 acres, it was donated to Rice by the Humble Oil Company. Somewhere, Edna Ferber let out a sigh. Big Oil was going to the moon. Construction began on the site in early 1962. Later that year, on September 12th, President Kennedy delivered a stirring speech at Rice, where he made light of the new Space Center. He stated, "What was once the furthest outpost on the old frontier of the West is to become the furthest outpost on the new frontier of science and space. Houston, with its manned spacecraft center, is to become the heart of a large scientific and engineering community." Texas, the place known for its simple folk and country accents, had just been told by the president that it was to become the heart of burgeoning new science and technology. The importance of this moment cannot be overstated. This didn't just change how others felt about the state of Texas, but how Texans felt about themselves. No longer did Texans feel relegated to a life on the oil rig or in the cow pasture. They were breaking free from stereotypes. Edna Ferber and her disdain for the state no longer seemed so giant. They would put a man on the moon, and they would do it their way. People were going to have to get used to their southern drawl after all. The new Space Center had an immediate impact on the local economy. For example, prior to NASA's decision to move the Space Center to Texas, the Clear Lake area south of Greater Houston had a population of 6,520 people, with land selling for less than $750 an acre. By the end of the decade, the population had risen to 45,000 people, with a half acre of land selling for over $6,000. To further my point on the economic impact of the Space Center, let's take a look at how NASA was able to utilize local businesses. In 1963, Brown and Root Incorporated, a Houston-based construction company, was given $1.5 million for construction done on the new Space Center. SIP Incorporated of Houston, an engineering firm, was given nearly $300,000 to design and install the environmental space chamber at the new NASA facility. In 1966, Warrior Constructors Incorporated of Houston and the National Electronic Corps of Houston were awarded a contract of $4.3 million to design and install the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, which would house the returned lunar samples from the Apollo missions. Texas benefited in many other ways as the new Space Center helped to polish the reputation of Texan academia. On January 4th, 1963, Dr. Kenneth S. Pitzer, then president of Rice University, announced the establishment of the new Space Science Department at Rice. Although other institutions across the country, such as UC Berkeley and UCLA, offered postgraduate study on the subject, Rice became the only institution in America to offer space science as an exclusive department. Now, NASA could train their scientist astronauts closer to home. The money would continue to cascade into Texas. NASA awarded Rice a $1.6 million grant to build their world-renowned space science and technology building. It would serve as the vessel through which over 50 students and faculty members worked on 35 space-related projects throughout the decade. Rice was gaining international recognition, and they're helping prove that Texas had a little more than just oil. A slightly lesser known, but nonetheless momentous impact of the new Space Center was forcing Rice to change their discriminatory admissions policies. In 1963, the US government passed a resolution stating that after August 16, 1964, federal agencies were restricted from awarding colleges to contracts or universities that discriminated based on race, creed, color, or national origins in their admissions process. Rice was the only non-sectarian private university in the South that still prohibited the admission of African American students. In February of 1964, recognizing that it would not only prohibit them from obtaining NASA grants, but also hurt the recruitment of first-rate students and faculty members, the Rice Board of Trustees filed a petition seeking to disregard racial restrictions set out by the university's founder, William Marsh Rice, in an 1891 indenture. The university's attorney, Tom Martin Davis, put it quite eloquently. He stated, "Rice University today is at the crossroads. It could go to the moon, or it could return to the 19th century. Ultimately, it would be the moon. The 127th District Court ruled in Rice's favor, and in 1965, Raymond Johnson became the first African American to be admitted into Rice." The new Space Center had great economic, academic, and social change in the state of Texas, but when the astronauts actually landed on the moon in July of 1969, fulfilling Kennedy's promise, it was clear that the citizens of Texas had been deeply impacted. Dr. Greg Cantrell of CCU remarked, "I was intensely proud that Texas was the home base for the space program. Watching those grainy images and staticky audio of the first moon landing is indelibly etched on my mind, even though I was only 11. I know it sounds corny, but it still makes a shiver run up my spine when I think back on it. The fact that the US was able to put those men on the moon and beat the Russians to it made kids of my generation feel as though there was nothing we couldn't do if we set our minds to it." Dr. Stephen Hardin of McMurray University remarked, "Our prominent role in the space program reminded folks that Texans were, and long had been, contributors to a vibrant American culture. It remains a source of pride that the first word uttered by a man from the moon was Houston." As Dr. Hardin pointed out, there's an awful lot that Neil Armstrong could have said. He could have said, "Oh my God," or "We did it," or anything like that. I mean, that's what you would expect. But he didn't. The first words spoken by a man from the moon were, "Houston, tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed." On the day of the greatest scientific achievement humanity had ever seen, the world turned their attention to Texas, and still do to this day. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.